Marple decided to miss out on the afternoon's sightseeing. She admitted to being somewhat tired, and would perhaps give a miss to an ancient church and its 14th-century glass. She would rest for a while and join them at the tea-room, which had been pointed out to her in the main street. Mrs. Sandbourne agreed that she was being very sensible. Miss Marple, resting on a comfortable bench outside the tea-room, reflected on what she planned to do next, and whether it would be wise to do it or not. When the others joined her at tea-time, it was easy for her to attach herself unobtrusively to Miss Cook and Miss Barrow, and sit with them at a table for 4. The 4th chair was occupied by Mr. Casper, whom Miss Marple considered as not sufficiently conversant with the English language to matter. Leaning across the table as she nibbled a slice of Swiss roll, Miss Marple said to Miss Cook,
"You know I am quite sure we've met before. I was wondering and wondering about it, but I'm not so good as I used to be at remembering faces. But I am sure I've met you somewhere."
Miss Cook looked kindly but doubtful. Her eyes went to her friend, Miss Barrow. So did Miss Marple's. Miss Barrow showed no signs of helping to probe the mystery.
"I don't know if you've ever stayed in my part of the world. I live in St. Mary Mead. It's quite a small village, you know. At least not so small nowadays. There is so much building going on everywhere. It's not very far from Muxbenham, and only 12 miles from the coast at Loomuth."
"Oh, let me see," said Miss Cook.
"I know Loomuth quite well, so perhaps—"
Suddenly Miss Marple made a pleased exclamation.
"Why, of course! I was in my garden one day at St. Mary Mead, and you spoke to me as you were passing on the footpath. You said you were staying down there, I remember, with a friend.
Of course! Oh, how stupid of me! I do remember you now. We spoke of how difficult it was nowadays to get anyone to do job gardening. Anyone who was any use.
Yes. You were not living there, I think. You were staying with someone.
Yes. I was staying with
Mrs. Sutherland, wasn't it?"
"No, it was, Hastings," said Miss Barrow, firmly, as she took a piece of chocolate cake.
"Oh, yes, in one of the new houses."
"Hastings?" said Mr. Casper unexpectedly. "I have been to Hastings. I have been to Eastbourne, too. Ah, it's very nice. By the sea."
"Such a coincidence meeting you again so soon. Such a small world, isn't it?"
"Well, we're all so fond of gardens."
"Flowers, very pretty. I like very much."
Ah, he beamed at them. "So many rare and beautiful shrubs," said Miss Cook. Miss Marple went full speed ahead with a gardening conversation of some technicality. Miss Cook responded. Miss Barrow put in an occasional remark. Mr. Casper relapsed into smiling silence. Later, as Miss Marple took her usual rest before dinner, she conned over what she had collected. Miss Cook had admitted being in St. Mary Mead. She had admitted walking past Miss Marple's house. Had agreed it was quite a coincidence.
Coincidence!
She turned the word over in her mouth rather as a child might do with a certain lollipop to decide its flavour. Was it coincidence? Or had there been some reason to come there? Had she been sent there? Sent there for what reason? Was it a ridiculous thing to imagine?
Any coincidence is always worth noticing. You can throw it away later if it is only coincidence.
Miss Cook and Miss Barrow appeared to be a perfectly normal pair of friends, doing the kind of tour which, according to them, they did every year. They had been on the Hellenic cruise last year, and a tour of bulbs in Holland the year before, and Northern Ireland the year before that. They seemed perfectly pleasant and ordinary people. But Miss Cook, she thought, had for a moment looked as though she were about to disclaim her visit to St. Mary Mead. She had looked at her friend, Miss Barrow, rather as though she were seeking instruction as to what to say. Miss Barrow was presumably the senior partner.
Of course, really, I may be imagining all sorts of things, and they have no significance whatsoever.
But the word danger came unexpectedly into her mind, used by Mr. Raphael in his first letter, and there had been some reference to her needing a guardian angel in the second one. Was she going into danger in this business? And why? From whom? Surely not from Miss Cook and Miss Barrow, such an ordinary-looking couple. All the same, Miss Cook had dyed her hair and altered her style of hairdressing. disguised her appearance as much as she could, in fact, which was odd, to say the least of it. She considered once more her fellow travellers. Mr. Casper, now, it would have been much easier to imagine he dangerous. Did he understand more English when he pretended to? She began to wonder about Mr. Casper. Miss Marple had never quite succeeded in abandoning her Victorian view of foreigners. One never knew with foreigners. Quite absurd, of course, to feel like that. She'd many friends from various foreign countries. All the same, Miss Cook, Miss Barrow, Mr. Casper, that young man with the wild hair, Emlyn something, a revolutionary, a practising anarchist, Mr. and Mrs. Butler, such nice Americans, but perhaps too good to be true. Really, I must pull myself together. She turned her attention to the itinerary of her trip. Tomorrow, she thought, was going to be rather strenuous. A morning's sightseeing drive, starting rather early. A long, rather athletic walk on a coastal path in the afternoon. Certain interesting marine flowering plants. It would be tiring. A tactful suggestion was appended. Anyone who felt like a rest could stay behind in their hotel, the Golden Boar, which had a very pleasant garden, or could do a short excursion, which would only take an hour, to a beauty spot nearby. She thought perhaps she'd do that. But though she did not know it then, her plans were to be suddenly altered. As Miss Marple came down from her room in the Golden Boar the next day, after washing her hands before luncheon, a woman in a tweed coat and skirt came forward, rather nervously, and spoke to her.
"Excuse me, are you Miss Marple? Miss Jane Marple?" "Yes, that is my name." "My name is Mrs. Glynn, Lavinia Glynn. I and my 2 sisters live near here. Well, we heard you were coming, you see." "You heard I was coming?" "Yes. A very old friend of ours wrote to us. Oh, it was quite some time ago. It must have been 3 weeks. He asked us to make a note of this date, the date of the famous Houses and Gardens tour. He said that a great friend of his, or a relation, I'm not quite sure which, would be on the tour."
Miss Marple continued to look surprised.
"I'm speaking of a Mr. Raphael."
"Oh, Mr. Raphael! Oh!"
"You know that he died? Oh, yes, so sad. Just after his letter came. I think it must have been very soon after he wrote to us. But we felt a special urgency to try to do what he asked. He suggested, that perhaps you would like to come and stay with us for a couple of nights. This part of the tour is rather strenuous. I mean, it's all right for the young people, but it's very trying for someone older. It involves several miles of walking and a certain amount of climbing up difficult cliff paths and places. My sisters and I would be so very pleased if you could come and stay in our house here. I'm sure we could show you many interesting things locally."
Miss Marple hesitated a minute. She liked the look of Mrs. Glynn, plump, good-natured, friendly, though a little shy. Perhaps, here again, must be Mr. Raphael's instructions. This was the next step for her to take. It must be so. She wondered why she felt nervous. Perhaps because she was now at home with the people in the tour and felt part of a group, although she'd only known them for 3 days. She turned to where Mrs. Glynn was standing, looking at her anxiously.
"Thank you. That is most kind of you. I shall be very pleased to come."
Miss Marple stood looking out of a window. Behind her on the bed was her suitcase. She looked out over the garden with unseeing eyes. It was not often that she failed to see a garden she was looking at, in either a mood of admiration or a mood of criticism, and in this case it would presumably have been criticism, because it was a neglected garden, a garden on which little money had been spent, possibly for some years, and on which very little work had been done. The house, too, had been neglected. It was well proportioned. The furniture in it had been good furniture once, but had had little in late years of polishing or attention. It was not a house, she thought, that had been, at any rate of late years, loved in any way. It lived up to its name, the old manor house, a house built with grace and a certain amount of beauty, lived in once, cherished. The daughters and sons had married and left, and now it was lived in by Mrs. Glynn, who, from a word she had let fall when she showed Miss Marple up to the bedroom appointed to her, had inherited it with her sisters from an uncle, and had come here to live with her sisters after her husband had died. They'd all grown older, their incomes had dwindled, labour had been more and more difficult to get. The other sisters presumably had remained unmarried, one older, one younger than Mrs. Glynn, the two Miss Bradbury Scotts. There was no sign of anything which belonged to a child in this house, no discarded ball, no old perambulator, no little chair or a table. This was just a house with 3 sisters.
How very Russian. Now, was that by Chekhov or Dostoevsky? Oh, I can't remember. 3 sisters. But these will certainly not be the kind of 3 sisters who are yearning to get to Moscow. Dear me, no.
These 3 sisters were presumably, she thought, content to remain where they were. She'd been introduced to the other 2 who had come out of the kitchen and down a flight of stairs to welcome her. Their manners were well-bred and gracious. They were what Miss Marple would have called in her youth, by the now obsolete term, ladies, and what she once recalled calling decayed ladies. Her father had said to her, "No, dear Jane, not decayed, distressed gentlewomen." Gentlewomen nowadays were not so liable to be distressed. They were aided by government, or by societies, or by a rich relation, or perhaps by someone like Mr. Raphael, because, after all, that was the whole point, the whole reason for her being here, wasn't it? Mr. Raphael had arranged all this. He had taken, Miss Marple thought, a good deal of trouble about it. He had known, presumably, some 4 or 5 weeks before his death, just when that death was likely to be, give and take a little. Since doctors were usually moderately optimistic, knowing from experience that patients who ought to die within a certain period very often take an unexpected lease of life and linger on, still doomed, but obstinately declining to take the final step. On the other hand, hospital nurses, when in charge of patients, had, Miss Marple thought from her experience, always expected the patients to be dead the next day, and were much surprised when they were not. But in voicing their gloomy views to Doctor when he came, they were apt to receive in reply, as the doctor went out of the hall door, a private aside of, "Linger a few weeks yet, I shouldn't wonder." Very nice of Doctor to be so optimistic, nurse would think, but surely Doctor was wrong. Doctor very often wasn't wrong. He knew that people who were in pain, helpless, crippled, even unhappy, still liked living and wanting to live. They would take one of Doctor's pills to help them pass the night, but they had no intention of taking a few more than necessary of the Doctor's pills, just in order to pass the threshold to a world that they did not as yet know anything about. Mr. Raphael. That was the person Miss Marple was thinking about as she looked across the garden with unseeing eyes. Mr. Raphael. She felt now she was getting a little closer to understanding this task laid upon her, the project suggested to her. Mr. Raphael was a man who made plans, made them in the same way that he planned financial deals and takeovers. In the words of her companion, Cherry, he had had a problem. When Cherry had a problem, she often came and consulted Miss Marple about it. This was a problem Mr. Raphael could not deal with himself, which must have annoyed him very much, Miss Marple thought, because he could usually deal with any problem himself, and insist on doing so. But he was bedridden and dying. He could arrange his financial affairs, communicate with his lawyers, with his employees, and with such friends and relations as he had, but there was something or someone that he had not arranged for. A problem he had not solved. A problem he still wanted to solve, a project he still wanted to bring about. And apparently it was not one that could be settled by financial aid, by business dealings, by the services of a lawyer. So he thought of me. It still surprised her very much indeed. However, in the sense she was now thinking of it, his letter had been quite explicit. He had thought she had certain qualifications for doing something. It had to do, she thought once again, with something in the nature of crime or affected by crime. The only other thing he knew about Miss Marple was that she was devoted to gardens. Well, it could hardly be a gardening problem that he wanted her to solve. But he might think of her in connection with crime. Crime in the West Indies, and crimes in her own neighbourhood at home. A crime? Where? Mr. Raphael had made arrangements to begin with his lawyers. Well, they'd done their part. After the right interval of time, they'd forwarded to her his letter. It had been, she thought, a well-considered and well-thought-out letter. It would have been simpler, certainly, to tell her exactly what he wanted her to do and why, and she was surprised in a way that he had not, before his death, sent for her, probably in a somewhat peremptory way, and more or less lying on what would be assured to be his deathbed, and bullied her personally until she consented to do what he was asking. But no, that would not really have been Mr. Raphael's way. He could bully people, none better. But this was not a case for bullying. He did not wish either, she was sure, to appeal to her or beg her to do him a favour, to urge her to redress a wrong. No, that again would not have been Mr. Raphael's way. He wanted, she thought, as he had probably wanted all his life, to pay for what he required. He wanted to pay her, and therefore he wanted to interest her enough to enjoy doing certain work. The pay was offered to intrigue her, not really to tempt her. It was to arouse her interest. She did not think that he had said to himself, offer enough money and she'd leap at it, because, as she knew very well herself, the money sounded very agreeable, but she was not in urgent need of money. She had her dear and affectionate nephew, who, if she was in straits for money of any kind, if she needed repairs to her house, or a visit to a specialist, or special treats, dear Raymond would always provide them. No, the sum he offered was to be exciting. It was to be exciting in the same way as it was exciting when you had a ticket for the Irish sweep. It was a fine, big sum of money that you could never achieve by any other means but luck. But all the same, Miss Marple thought to herself, she would need some luck as well as hard work. She would require a lot of thought and pondering, and possibly what she was doing might involve a certain amount of danger. But she'd got to find out herself what it was all about. He was not going to tell her. Partly because he did not want to influence her, perhaps. It's hard to tell anyone about something without letting slip your own point of view about it. It could be that Mr. Raphael had thought that his own point of view might be wrong. It was not very like him to think such a thing, but it could be possible. He might suspect that his judgment, impaired by illness, was not quite as good as it used to be. So she, Miss Marple, his agent, his employee, was to make her own guesses and come to her own conclusions. Well, it was time she came to a few now. In other words, back to the old question. What was this all about? She'd been directed, take that first. She'd been directed by a man who was now dead. She'd been directed away from St. Mary Mead, so the task, whatever it was, could not be attacked from there. It was not a neighbourhood problem. It was not a problem that you could solve just by looking through newspaper cuttings or making inquiries. Not, that is, until you found what you had to make inquiries about. She'd been directed, first to the lawyer's office, then to read a letter, 2 letters, in her home, then to be sent on a pleasant and well-run tour around some of the famous houses and gardens of Great Britain. From there she'd come to the next stepping stone, the house she was in at the moment, the old manor house, just in St. Mary, where lived Miss Clotilde Bradbury-Scott, Mrs. Glynn, and Miss Anthea Bradbury-Scott. Mr. Raphael had arranged it beforehand, some weeks before he died. Probably it was the next thing he had done after instructing his lawyers and after booking a seat on the tour. Therefore, she was in this house for a purpose. It might be for 2 nights only, it might be longer. There might be certain things arranged which would lead her to stay longer, or she would be asked to stay longer. That brought her back to where she stood now. Mrs. Glynn and her 2 sisters. They must be concerned, implicated in whatever it was. She would have to find out what it was. Her time was short. That was the only trouble. Miss Marple had no doubt for one moment that she had the capacity to find out things. She was one of those chatty, fluffy old ladies whom other people expect to talk and ask questions. On the face of it, questions that are merely gossipy. She would talk about her childhood, and that would lead to one of her sisters talking about theirs. She'd talk about food she'd eaten, servants she'd had, daughters and cousins and relations, travel, marriages, births, and, yes, deaths. There must be no show of special interest in her eyes when she heard about a death. Not at all. Almost automatically she was sure she could come up with a right response, such as, "Oh, dear me, how very sad." She would have to find out about relationships, incidents, life stories, see if any suggestive incidents could pop up, so to speak. It might be some incidents in the neighbourhood, not directly concerned with these 3 people, but something they would know about and could talk about. Anyway, there would be something, some clue, some pointer. The second day from now she would rejoin the tour, unless she had by that time some indication that she was not to rejoin the tour. Her mind swept from the house to the coach and the people who had sat in it. It might be that what she was seeking had been there in the coach, and would be there again when she rejoined it. One person, several people, some innocent, some not so innocent, some long-past story. She frowned a little, trying to remember something that had flashed in her mind that she had thought, really, I am sure. Of what had she been sure? Her mind went back to the three sisters. She must not be too long up here. She must unpack a few modest needs for 2 nights, something to change into this evening, some nightclothes, sponge bag, then go down and rejoin her hostesses and make pleasant talk. A main point had to be decided, though. Were the three sisters to be her allies, or were they her enemies? They might fall into either category. She must think about that carefully. There was a tap on the door, and Mrs. Glynn entered.
"I do hope you will be quite comfortable here. Can I help you unpack? We have a very nice woman who comes in, but she's only here in the mornings. She'll help you with anything."
"Oh, no, thank you. I just took a few necessities."
"I thought I'd show you the way downstairs again. It's rather a rambling house, you know. There are 2 staircases, and it does make it a little difficult. Sometimes people lose their way."
"Oh, that's very kind of you."
"I hope you'll come downstairs, and we can have a glass of sherry before lunch."
Miss Marple accepted gratefully, and followed her guide down the stairs. Mrs. Glynn, she judged, was a good many years younger than she herself. Miss Marple negotiated the stairs carefully. Her left knee was always a little uncertain. There was, however, a banister on one side, and very beautiful stairs they were. She remarked on them.
"This really is a very lovely house. I suppose it was built in the 1700s, am I right?" 1780.
She seemed pleased with Miss Marple's appreciation. She took Miss Marple into the drawing-room. A large, graceful room. There were 1 or 2 other beautiful pieces of furniture. A Queen Anne desk, a William and Mary oyster-shell bureau. There were also some rather cumbrous Victorian settees and cabinets. The curtains were of chintz, faded and somewhat worn. The carpet was, Miss Marple thought, Irish, possibly a Limerick Aberson type. The sofa was ponderous, and the velvet of it much worn. The other 2 sisters were already sitting there. They rose as Miss Marple came in and approached her, one with a glass of sherry, the other directing her to a chair.
"I don't know whether you like sitting rather high. So many people do."
"I do. It's so much easier. One's back, you know." The sisters appeared to know about the difficulties of backs. The eldest of the sisters was a tall, handsome woman, dark, with a black coil of hair. The other one might have been a good deal younger. She was thin, with grey hair that had once been fair, hanging untidily on her shoulders, and a faintly wraith-like appearance. She could be cast successfully as a mature Ophelia, Miss Marple thought. Clotilde, Miss Marple thought, was certainly no Ophelia, but she would have made a magnificent Clytemnestra. She could have stabbed her husband in his bath for exultation, but since she'd never had a husband, that solution wouldn't do. Miss Marple could not see her murdering anyone but a husband, and there had been no Agamemnon in this house. Clotilde Bradbury Scott, Anthea Bradbury Scott, Lavinia Glynn. Clotilde was handsome, Lavinia was plain but pleasant-looking. Anthea had one eyelid which twitched from time to time. Her eyes were large and grey, and she had an odd way of glancing round to right, then to left, and then suddenly, in a rather strange manner, behind her, over her shoulder. It was as though she thought someone was watching her all the time. Odd, thought Miss Marple. She wondered a little about Anthea. They sat down, and conversation ensued. Mrs. Glynn left the room, apparently for the kitchen. She was, it seemed, the active domestic one of the 3. The conversation took a usual course. Clotilde Bradbury Scott explained that the house was a family one. It had belonged to her great-uncle and then to her uncle, and when he had died it was left to her and her 2 sisters, who had joined her there. He only had one son, you see, and he was killed in the war. We are really the last of the family, except for some very distant cousins. It's a beautifully proportioned house. Your sister tells me it was built around 1780. Yes, I believe so. One could wish, you know, it was not quite so large and rambling. Repairs, oh, they come very heavy nowadays. Oh, yes, indeed. And in many ways we've had to let a lot of it just fall down. It's sad, but there it is.
A lot of the outhouses too, for instance, and a greenhouse. We had a very beautiful big greenhouse. Lovely muscat grapevine in it, said Anthea, and cherry pie used to grow along the walls inside. Yes, I regret that very much. Of course, during the war, one could not get any gardeners. We had a very young gardener when he was called up. One does not, of course, grudge that, but all the same it was impossible to get things repaired, and the whole greenhouse fell down. So did that little conservatory near the house.
Both sisters sighed, with the sighing of those who have noted time passing, and times changing, but not for the better. There was a melancholy here in this house, thought Miss Marple. It was impregnated somehow with sorrow, a sorrow that could not be dispersed or removed, since it had penetrated so deep. It had sunk in. She shivered suddenly.
It really is a most...
The meal was conventional. A small joint of mutton, roast potatoes, followed by a plum tart with a small jug of cream and rather indifferent pastry. There were a few pictures around the dining room wall, family pictures, Miss Marple presumed, Victorian portraits without any particular merit. The sideboard was large and heavy, a handsome piece of plum-coloured mahogany. The curtains were of dark crimson damask, and at the big mahogany table 10 people could easily have been seated. Miss Marple chatted about the incidents of the tour, insofar as she had been on it. As this, however, had only been 3 days, there was not very much to say.
Interesting talk on the architecture.
Mr. Raphael, I suppose, was an old friend of yours?
Oh, not really. I met him first when I was on a cruise to the West Indies. He was out there for his health, I imagine. Yes, he had been very crippled for some years. It was very sad indeed. I really admired his fortitude. He seemed to manage to do so much work. Every day, you know, he dictated to his secretary. He was continually sending off cables. He did not seem to give in at all kindly to being an invalid. Oh, no, he wouldn't. We've not seen much of him of late years. He was a busy man, of course, but he always remembered us at Christmas very kindly. Do you live in London, Miss Marple? Oh, no, I live in the country, a very small place halfway down between Loomuth and Market Basing. It's about 25 miles from London. I used to be in a very pretty old-world village, but of course, like everything else, it's becoming what they call developed nowadays. Mr. Raphael, I suppose, lived in London. At least I noticed in the St. Honore Hotel register that his address was somewhere in Eaton Square, I think, or was it Belgrave Square? He had a country house in Kent. He used to entertain there, I think, sometimes. Business friends mostly, you know, or people from abroad. I don't think any of us ever visited him there. He always entertained us in London, on the rare occasions when we happened to meet. How very kind of him to suggest that you invite me here during the course of his tour. It's very thoughtful. One wouldn't really have expected such a busy man to have had such kindly thoughts. We have invited before friends of his who have been on these tours. On the whole, they are very considerate the way they arrange these things. It is impossible, of course, to suit everybody's taste. The young ones naturally wish to walk or make long excursions, to ascend hills for a view and all that sort of thing, and the older ones who are not up to it remain in the hotels. But hotels round here are not at all luxurious. I'm sure you would have found today's trip, and the one to St. Bonaventure tomorrow, very fatiguing. Tomorrow, I believe, is a visit to an island, you know, in a boat. Sometimes that can be very rough. Even going round houses can be very tiring. Oh, yes, I know. So much walking and standing about. One's feet get very tired. I suppose really I ought to take these expeditions, but it's such a temptation to see beautiful buildings and fine rooms and furniture. All these things. And, of course, some splendid pictures. And the gardens. You like gardens, don't you? Oh, yes, especially the gardens. From a description in the prospectus, I am really looking forward very much to seeing some of the really fine-kept gardens of the historic houses. We've still several to visit. She beamed around the table. It was all very pleasant, very natural, and yet she wondered why, for some reason, she had a feeling of strain.
a feeling that there was something unnatural here. But what did she mean by unnatural? The conversation was ordinary enough, consisting mainly of platitudes. She herself was making conventional remarks, and so were the three sisters. The three sisters. Why did anything thought of in threes somehow seem to suggest a sinister atmosphere? The three sisters, the three witches of Macbeth. Well, one could hardly compare these three sisters to the three witches, although Miss Marple had always thought at the back of her mind that the theatrical producers made a mistake in the way in which they produced the three witches. One production which she had seen, indeed, seemed to her quite absurd, for the witches had looked more like pantomime creatures with flapping wings and ridiculously spectacular steeple hats. They danced and slithered about. Miss Marple remembered saying to her nephew, who was standing her this Shakespearean treat,
"You know, Raymond, my dear, if I were ever producing this splendid play, I would make the three witches quite different. I would have them three ordinary, normal old women, old Scottish women. They wouldn't dance or caper. They would look at each other rather slyly, and you'd feel a sort of menace just behind the ordinariness of them."
Miss Marple helped herself to the last mouthful of plum tart, and looked across the table at Anthea. Ordinary, untidy, very vague-looking, a bit scatty. Why should she feel that Anthea was sinister?
"I'm imagining things. I must not do that."
After luncheon she was taken on a tour of the garden. It was Anthea who was deputed to accompany her. It was, Miss Marple thought, rather a sad progress. Here there had been a well-kept, though certainly not in any way outstanding or remarkable, garden. It had had the elements of an ordinary Victorian garden, a shrubbery, a drive of speckled laurels. No doubt there had once been a well-kept lawn and paths, a kitchen garden of about 1.5 acres, too big evidently for the three sisters who lived here now. Part of it was unplanted and had gone largely to weeds. Ground elder had taken over most of the flower-beds, and Miss Marple's hands could hardly restrain themselves from pulling up the vagrant bindweed asserting its superiority. Miss Anthea's long hair flapped in the wind, shredding from time to time a vague hairpin on the path of the grass.
"You have a nice garden, I expect." "Oh, it's a very small one."
They had come along a grass path and were pausing in front of a kind of hillock, but rested against the wall at the end of it.
"Our greenhouse." "Oh, yes, where you had such a delightful grapevine." "3 vines. A black Hamburg and one of those small white grapes, very sweet, you know, and a 3rd one of beautiful muscats." "And a heliotrope, you said." "Cherry pie. Oh, yes, cherry pie. Such a lovely smell." "Was there any bomb trouble around here? Did that knock the greenhouse down?" "Oh, no. We never suffered from anything of that kind. This neighbourhood was quite free of bombs. I'm afraid it just fell down from decay. We hadn't been here so very long, and we had no money to repair it or build it up again. And in fact it wouldn't have been worth it, really, because we couldn't have kept it up even if we did. I'm afraid we just let it fall down. There was nothing else we could do. And now, you see, it's all grown over. Oh, yes, completely covered by... Now, what is that flowering creeper just coming into bloom? Oh, yes, it's quite a common one. Oh, it begins with a P. Now, what is the name of it? Polly something like that. Yes. Oh, I think I know the name. Polygonum bolshonicum. Very quick-growing, I think, isn't it? Very useful, really, if one wants to hide the tumble-down building or anything ugly of that kind.
The mound in front of her was certainly thickly covered with the all-enveloping green and white flowering plant. It was, as Miss Marple well knew, a kind of menace to anything else that wanted to grow. Polygonum covered everything, and covered it in a remarkably short time.
The greenhouse must have been quite a big one. Oh, yes, we had peaches in it, too, and nectarines. Oh, well, it looks very pretty now. They're very pretty little white flowers, aren't they? We have a very nice magnolia tree down this path to the left. Once I believe there used to be a very fine border here, A herbaceous border. That again one cannot keep up. It's too difficult. Everything is too difficult. Nothing is like it used to be. It's all spoilt everywhere.
She led the way quickly down a path at right angles which ran along a side wall. Her pace had increased. Miss Marple could hardly keep up with her. It was, thought Miss Marple, as though she were deliberately being steered away from the Polygonum mound by her hostess. Steered away as if from some ugly or displeasing spot. Was she ashamed, perhaps, that the past glories no longer remained? The Polygonum certainly was growing with extraordinary abandonment. It was not even being clipped or kept to reasonable proportions. It made a kind of flowery wilderness of that bit of a garden. She almost looks as though she were running away from it, thought Miss Marple. Presently her attention was diverted to a broken-down pigsty which had a few rose tendrils growing round it.
My great-uncle used to keep a few pigs, but of course one would never dream of doing anything like that nowadays, would one? Rather noisome, I'm afraid. We have a few Floribunda roses near the house. I really think Floribundas are such a great answer to difficulties.
Oh, I know. She mentioned the names of a few recent productions in the rose line, all the names she thought were entirely strange to Miss Anthea.
Do you often come on these tours?
The question came suddenly.
Oh, you mean tours of houses and gardens? Yes, some people do it every year. Well, no, I couldn't hope to do that. They're rather expensive, you see. A friend very kindly gave me a present of this to celebrate my next birthday. So kind.
Oh,
I wondered why you came. It's bound to be tiring, isn't it? Still, if you usually go to the West Indies, and places like that. Oh, the West Indies was the result of kindness, too, on the part of a nephew. A dear boy. He's so very thoughtful for his old aunt. Oh, I see. Yes, I see. I don't know what one would do without the younger generation. They are so kind, are they not? I suppose they are. I don't really know. We haven't any young relations. Does your sister, Mrs. Glynn, have any children? She did not mention any. One never likes to ask. No, she and her husband never had any children. It's as well, perhaps.
What do you mean by that? Miss Marple wondered as they returned to the house.